Hi Year 6, it's Tuesday the 5th of May and today we're going to be generating some language to describe contrasting settings. If you cast your mind back to yesterday, in the story we were introduced to Cherry and her 4 brothers who are on holiday in Cornwall. Cherry has been making a special giant's necklace out of cowrie shells. And just in case you weren't sure, I've included a picture of cowrie shells so you can tell what she's been looking for on the beach to thread through pieces of seaweed. The next section of the story takes place in a little cove in Cornwall called Boat Cove, and I thought you'd like to see a little picture of it so that it helps you set the story in your head. This is another cove in Cornwall, not far from where Cherry was staying, and it might help you to picture the type of place where she was on holiday. The first task for today is to describe the beach that Cherry is on when it is sunny, warm, and an idyllic place to be. You can divide your page into a grid like this, or you can print a sheet off from the website if you prefer. I'm going to read the description of Cherry on Boat Cove in the sunshine. That is the first setting that we're going to be describing tomorrow, so try and keep a picture in your head of what it looks like and how you might describe it using just words and phrases. If you remember yesterday, we had just left the story where Cherry had hurled insults up the stairs to her brothers. Boat Cove, just below Zennor Head, was the beach they had found and occupied. Every year, for as long as Cherry could remember, they had rented the same granite cottage, set back in the fields below the Eagle's Nest, and every year they came to the same beach, because no one else ever did. In 2 weeks, not another soul had ventured down the winding track through the bracken from the coastal path. It was a long climb down and a very much longer one up. The beach itself was almost hidden from the path that ran along the cliff top 100 feet above. It was private and perfect and theirs. The boys swam in amongst the rocks, diving and snorkeling for hours on end. Her mother and father would sit side by side on stripy deck chairs. She would read endlessly, and he would close his eyes against the sun and dream for hours on end. Cherry moved away from them and clambered over the rocks to a narrow strip of sand in the cove beyond the rocks. And here it was that she mined for the cowrie shells. In the gritty sand under the cliff face, she had found a particularly rich deposit. She was looking for pink cowrie shells of a uniform length, colour and shape. That was what took the time. Occasionally, the boys would swim around the rocks and into her little beach, emerging from the sea all goggled and flippered to mock her. But as she paid them little attention, they soon tired and went away again. She knew time was running short. This was her very last chance to find enough shells to complete the giant's necklace, and it had to be done. The sea was calmer that day than she had ever seen it. The heat beat down from a windless, cloudless sky. Even the gulls and kittiwakes seemed to be silenced by the sun. Cherry searched on, stopping only for a picnic lunch of pasties and tomatoes with the family before returning at once to her shells. In the end, the heat proved too much for her mother and father, who left the beach earlier than usual in mid-afternoon to begin to tidy up the cottage. The boys soon followed because they had tired of finding miniature crabs and seaweed instead of the sunken wrecks and treasure they had been seeking. So by tea time, Cherry was left on her own on the beach with strict instructions to keep her hat on, not to bathe alone, and to be back well before dark. She had calculated she needed 150 more cowrie shells, and so far she had only found 80. She would be back, she insisted, when she had finished collecting enough shells, and not before. Hopefully, having read that section of the story and looked at the pictures from beforehand, you have a really clear picture in your head of what Boat Cove was like. Think about what you could see, hear, feel and smell, and record it on your grid. Just like we've done before, use an online thesaurus or a thesaurus that you might have in your home and think about making your words and phrases as ambitious and interesting as you can. You can see that I've begun to fill in my grid with some ideas which you might want to use to help get you started. Remember, we only want to see words and phrases, not full sentences. Pause the slides to give you time to complete this section of your work. Now we're going to continue with the story. Had she not been so immersed in her search, sifting the shells through her fingers, she would have noticed the grey bank of cloud rolling in from the Atlantic. She would have noticed the white horses gathering out at sea and the tide moving in remorselessly to cover the rocks between her and Boat Cove. When the clouds cut off the warmth from the sun as evening came on and the sky and the sea turned grey, she shivered with cold and put on her sweater and jeans. She did look up then and saw the angry sea, but she saw no threat in that and did not look back over her shoulder to Boat Cove. She was aware that time was running out, so she went down on her knees again and dug feverishly in the sand. She had to collect 30 more shells. It was the baleful sound of the foghorn somewhere out at sea beyond Gunnar's Head that at last forced Cherry to take some account of the incoming tide. She looked for the rock she would have to clamber over to reach Boat Cove again and the winding track that would take her up the cliff path and safety, but they were gone. Where they should have been, the sea was already driving in against the cliff face. She was cut off. In a confusion of wonder and fear, she looked out to sea at the heaving ocean that moved in towards her, seeing it now as a writhing grey monster, breathing its fury on the rocks with every pounding wave. Still, Cherry did not forget her shells, but wrapping them inside her towel, she tucked them into her sweater and waded out through the surf towards the rocks. If she timed it right, she reasoned, she could scramble back over them and into the cove as the surf retreated. She reached the first of the rocks without too much difficulty. The sea here seemed to be protected from the force of the ocean by the rocks further out. Holding fast to the first rock she came to and with the sea up around her waist, she waited for the next incoming wave to break and retreat. The wave was unexpectedly impotent and fell limply on the rocks around her. She knew her moment had come and took it. She was not to know that piling up far out at sea was the first of the giant storm waves that had gathered several hundred miles out in the Atlantic, bringing with it all the momentum and violence of the deep ocean. The rocks were slippery underfoot, and more than once Cherry slipped down into the seething white rock pools where she had played so often when the tide was out. But she struggled on until finally she had climbed high enough to be able to see the thin strip of sand that was all that was left of Boat Cove. It was only a few yards away, so close. Until now she had been crying involuntarily, but now as she recognised the little path up through the bracken, her heart was lifted with hope and anticipation. She knew the worst was over, that if the sea would only hold back, she would reach the sanctuary of the cove. She turned and looked behind her to see how far away the next wave was, just to reassure herself that she had enough time. But the great surge of green water was on her before she could register either disappointment or fear. She was hurled back against the rock below her and covered at once by the sea. She was conscious as she went down that she was drowning, but she still clutched her shells against her chest and hoped she had enough of them at last to finish the giant's necklace. Those were her last thoughts before the sea took her away. So as you heard, the weather in that second section of the story changed dramatically, turning Boat Cove into a very different place. So your second task of the day is to generate language for Boat Cove when it is not such a welcoming, lovely place, but when it is stormy and frightening and the waves are crashing in over the sand. This picture might give you an idea of what it was like in Boat Cove when the weather started to change and the clouds started to get darker, the fog started to roll in, the waves started to get bigger. This picture might help you a little bit more with those great big rolling waves, that surge of green water crashing in from the Atlantic. As before, you're going to create another grid or print it off the website, and you're going to fill it in with language, words and phrases that could describe this scene. Just to remind you, we're only looking for words and phrases, and you can get some ideas from this partly filled in grid. I'm sure you have a lot of other ideas and language that you could add. Pause the slides here if you need to. Okay, well done. Now keep your word grid safe until Wednesday, and we'll see you tomorrow for a writing task connected to the language that you've been generating today.